Hey, welcome to Overtime, where we take Sunday's message further. My name is Jeremy, and I'm your host. And this is a podcast where we just want to ask the questions that we think that you would ask as it relates to Sunday's message. And as we do so, we hope that it helps you grow in your life and your faith. With that being said, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on all of the podcasts that are coming out. Not only that, hit the like button, because when you do so, it helps us help other people. And if you ever have a question about Sunday's content or about Overtime, you can submit those to overtime@npaustin.com, and we will be sure to get to those in future podcasts. So with that being said, here's a quick recap of Sunday, and then we're going to jump into our conversation today. Well, I don't have a good way to kick this off.
Well, we always struggle, I think, when you're the communicator, because you're the host but the communicator. So
Yep.
I'd love to see you interview yourself. You're the media guy too, so you can
I think
edit it right.
I'd probably get fired. And
No, you do 2 different T-shirts and then just like have a conversation back and forth with yourself and do
Oh,
all the
yeah.
editing and be perfect.
yeah,
I think you've got what it takes.
yeah, I think people would love that. That
Yeah.
sounds, yeah.
I would watch it.
Oh, yeah, you would watch it to laugh at me though, not with me kind of dynamic.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any tournament picks? Do you have anybody who's going to win it all for March Madness?
Oh gosh, you're asking me a basketball question after I
Sorry.
got on stage and said I don't do sports ball well.
Yeah. Hey,
You know-
Texas is good this year.
Yeah,
Texas.
well, that's literally what I was about to say.
Yeah.
It was like, well, Texas is good, so
Uh-huh.
I'm going for them.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think Texas is going to win it all.
Yeah.
Yeah, this year's our year. We just didn't know we've been saying that for basketball,
I
not
know.
football. Now okay.
Yeah.
We see how we've been saying that for basketball.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you have any picks?
I'm going to go Texas.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like it's actually it's weird because again, I don't know if you care that much about that, but the NBA is like kind of the same as college to me this year, where they're both like really wide open. It's very odd. Like
Yeah.
we had like a decade where it was like LeBron versus the Warriors, and now it's like there's like 15 NBA teams that seem like they could win it.
That's kind of fun, though, I feel like,
Yeah,
right?
it is cool.
I mean, it's
think
less
more parity.
monopolized.
Yeah, 100%. And I feel like college, there was some like, I don't know if it held all year, if it was like more one seeds had lost than ever in the first like month, but there were like the number one team changed a bunch all year long because kept losing. It was like Alabama, Houston, and then North Carolina is the first like preseason number one to not make the tournament, which is crazy. And they seem a little bit upset about it. So
I don't know why that would be.
it's just yeah. So it just is. I don't know. It's an interesting. And Texas is legit good. It feels like they could lose their second game to Texas A&M is really good. Penn State's really good, or they could win it all. I mean, they beat Kansas by 20 twice in a week span. So
Do you feel like people trust us when we talk about Texas sports? Like when we say, and Texas is actually good. Do you think everybody's just like rolling their eyes right now? Or do you think they really trust us when we say that?
well, if you should be skeptical. I mean, for sure. Like
Yeah.
they don't have a great track record recently.
Yeah.
You know, unless we're talking like volleyball, swimming, golf.
Well, I had a volunteer come up to me in between first and second service, and they were commenting on Shane doing the welcome. And they said, you guys talk about Texas football all the time when they're doing horrible, but you don't mention the basketball program when they're doing great.
Yeah,
Like,
we
what
won the
is wrong
Big
with
12 tournament, and there's no like.
that? Yeah, and Shane's like, oh, I forgot to mention it
Great, thanks.
as he's talking about basketball.
Yeah.
And we're what, a 2 seed?
Yeah, yep,
That's a big deal
yeah.
for those of us who understand what seeds are.
Yeah.
Which I do. I actually do.
I was like, I
you
think
taught
you
me
do.
years ago. You taught me years ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
For those of you who don't know, I used to room with this guy, and I was roommate, and he would fall asleep to Sports Center. So I actually had to learn a lot of things, like how to sleep with Sports Center on.
Yeah, you're
So.
still roommate in my phone.
Yeah.
Not sweet.
Yeah. That's nice.
That's what I have to say to Siri. Call roommate.
Yep. Yep. For most, yeah. If anybody got your phone, they would see like Emily and they see roommate. They'd be pretty confused. Yeah.
It's not clear, but
Yeah.
okay. You gonna get rolling?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. So this past week, we started a new series called Investigating Jesus, where we are doing just that. We are investigating this individual who made the biggest dent in history, altered the course of history forever. And we just talked about the significance of that and how much in culture and society has been impacted by him, and that all of us should pause at some point and ask the question of who do we believe he is. And it's an important question because of the implications on how we answer it. And that's a lot of what we talked about in part 1. But recognizing the series can raise a lot of questions in hopes that it also answers a lot of questions. One of the things that we thought we'd do is make this more of a dialogue than a monologue. And so we opened it up to people who are listening, watching throughout and here in person to just ask their own questions about Jesus, about faith. And then this podcast is essentially their podcast to be able to, you know, unpack some of the answers. And I would say it is very important to note that some of the questions that are asked are very common questions that people have about faith and spirituality and Christianity. And I want to go back to one of the points that I made early on in the message, which was that when you answer the question of who Jesus is, and if you answer it in such a way that you believe he is who he claimed to be, it's like this domino effect begins to happen that addresses a lot of these other questions. So who is God, and what about, you know, or who is God? Does God exist, in science, and why do bad things happen to good people? Like, those are all helpful. But the core question in Christianity, who is Jesus? It's like when you answer that and you come to the conclusion that he is who he claimed to be, if that's your conclusion, it does address a lot of these other questions, but these are still like helpful hangups to talk through. And so I just more or less, as I'm looking at these questions that people sent in, recognizing that these are difficult ones to have like a really emotionally satisfying black and white answer for, versus there's a lot of evidence that we could look at that says, here's who Jesus was, you know, did he come back to life, did he truly die on the cross, like all of those kind of things. There's a little bit more black and white evidence, you know, versus some of these other questions are a little harder to have that emotionally satisfying answer for. And so I just think that's important to recognize, you know, as we start talking through them in the beginning. So yeah, anything you would add before we jump in?
No, I'm excited. I mean, we say that about like, I think all series, that everyone we would do is better in a dialogue format, but
yeah,
I'm excited to see where these lead, and there's been creative ones already that I'm like, man, this is cool. People are thinking, you know, it's a credit to, I think, what you did in part 1, but I mean, people are sitting there like really considering, and that's what we'd hope for the series. So, yeah.
And both you and I think it's just good to recognize too, we are a little bit more intellectual in the way we approach some of these things. You know, some people, I guess if you go to right brain, left brain dominant, we might be a little left brain dominant. And, you know, part of the reason I think faith has been that way for us is because of our small group leader, Jeff Brown. And he was very much so like that as well. Yeah. And you had these 2 high school guys who were coming to him, and we were doing Inside Out, or The Point, like I mentioned on Sunday. And these 2 guys coming to him, asking him questions, and he's the one who first showed us this table of different New Testament manuscripts and how it compares to other historical works of antiquity. And so we love these things because we've spent hours and hours and hours talking to Jeff about some of this, and he's just I'm hoping we can get him on here for parts 2, 3, and 4 to actually talk through some of these questions as well, because he answers these things so well too.
100%.
So all right, well, let's jump in then. We got a couple of good questions. We're actually not going to be able to get to all of them in our podcast, so we're going to let some of them go to next week as well. Hopefully we can get through these first 5. But these are great questions, so thank you to whoever sent these in. The first one is, when discussing the reliable accounts of what actually happened during Jesus' time, how can I have conversations with Christ about friends who wonder why there doesn't appear to be a female written gospel, and when there have been other historical gospel writers who didn't make it into the Bible? Thank you.
I'm going to play editor, and just it's about Christ with friends, not with Christ about friends. I just, somebody could be confused. And maybe
did I say that the wrong way? I read that completely wrong.
Yeah, I realize there's no text on screen, so somebody could think it's opposite.
Yes, thank you. And there's kind of 2 questions here too that I didn't realize as we were talking through this beforehand. There's the question of like, how can I have conversations with friends? Yep. And then there's the question of, why doesn't there appear to be female written gospel, and why did other historical gospel writers not make it into the Bible? So why don't we tackle the back half of that first? And then I do think it's helpful to hit on, how can I have conversations with friends about Christ? Yeah. And talk through that. Yeah.
Well, again, you're the communicator, so it takes on an odd format in this. I'll jump in and start talking, but I'm like, you're as much getting
we'll just interject, have a conversation. Ideally, it's like we're sitting down having a coffee with the questioner, and we can just talk through some of these.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for me, that on the female portion of that, I think it's not emotionally satisfying, but I think the answer is actually a little bit more simple in that.
It's a little bit more of a black and white answer.
It's just a consequence of history. Like, it's the cultural context at the time. I looked this up. I heard this name, but had to go find it again. The woman who's recognized as being the first historian, and there's other names that pop up earlier and stuff like that, but the one who's commonly recognized, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name right, but it's Anna Karenina. And she was a princess from the Byzantine Empire. It was she lived in 1100. Yeah. You know what I mean? This is 1,000 years after Jesus, and she's recognized as being. So it's just a nature of a little bit of a combination of, you had a much higher percentage of the male population that could read and write, and so that was already a fact of history.
And it's almost hard for us to comprehend. There would have been almost little to no females who would have been educated to the point to be able to document what happened.
Right.
That's crazy for us to wrap our minds around, but it was such a dominant patriarchal society.
Right. Yeah. And then you had the fact of, even if they could, a lot of these cultures, a woman's testimony wouldn't hold up in court. And so you would be well, her account of the events didn't hold the same weight. And so obviously that's nothing to affirm what Christianity believes. That's not a value of, that's just saying the context and time period into which a lot of these. But I do like the way they wrote it, that, appear to be female written. I think that's kind of just fun to think about. There are plenty of Old Testament and New both, where the authorship is a little bit of a mystery to us. So we don't necessarily know. It would be interesting to find out if that was the case. But, most of the weight of scholarship would say, in all likelihood, that wasn't the case. So. And
I would add to that too, on the whole female thing. It's crazy enough that the New Testament gospel writers, to a patriarchal society at the time, as they're trying to say, hey, Jesus rose from the dead, that they talk about this group of women who were the first people to see him. If someone was making up this account of this guy coming back to life, that's the last thing they would have done to be credible.
Right.
But that's what they did. And that's how kind of the story of the gospel reads. It's so ahead of its time in the way it values women. Jesus uplifted women all the time in a society where that was not done. And then it uses, it talks about women being the first to see him risen from the dead. I think that's just pretty amazing.
Yes. Yeah. We could have a whole long conversation about how core and central they are to the entire story, and how that's just not what you would have written in this time period. But yet that's what happened. That's how God chose to do it. So yeah, 100%.
So the second part of that question then, when they're, who wonder why there doesn't appear to be a female written gospel, and when there have been other historical gospel writers, why didn't they make it into the Bible?
Yeah. And so then that becomes, actually, you explained a lot of this, and it would be, so you kind of included almost why we have what we have in the New Testament, based on when it was written, how many copies, and so on. And so there are documents that were not included for those exact same reasons, that they didn't meet that test. So, Gospel of Thomas might be the most famous one, because there's a book written about it and so on. But that's written hundreds of years later, not by Thomas, doesn't pass the test, right? So we have both, how many copies do we have close to the time of the actual events occurring? And then there's an apostolic connection as well. Did they have, were they either, or did they have, direct access to one of the 12 apostles? So that's a really important piece of it. There's obviously an acceptance by the Christian community, which I think is important to note. That doesn't mean they were filtering in and out. There wasn't some powerful structure, governing body, controlling a narrative. This is what you spoke to be there were specific names, specific places, specific professions, mentioned, that if that wasn't true, that it was held in check by the community to be no, that's not, that person, that's not his son, that's not where this happened. And so then when crazy talk starts to get thrown out, there are documents like that are no longer seen as authoritative or influential in the community.
Yeah, and I was going to add on that too. This is a little bit of a sidebar, and we'll get back to this question, but too, I was only able to briefly mention some of the other pieces of evidence that kind of support that the New Testament gospel writers really were the gospel writers, but it really does get so granular. Even in the way that you read both Matthew and John, who would have grown up near the Sea of Galilee, they call it the Sea of Galilee. And then you have Luke and John Mark, it gets confusing when you recognize him as John Mark, but that was his full name. John Mark, when they talk about it, they talk about it as more of a lake. And it's because they were familiar with much larger bodies of water. And so when they came and saw the Sea of Galilee, it's oh, that's more of a lake, because it was 13 miles across. And then but then you have the guys who grew up next to it who never saw a larger body of water, and they call it a sea. Which, just when you see the different ways that they approach things, it's like, oh, it's so granular and so specific in the way they talk about some of these things. And the reason I share that is because anybody who read some of these other gospel accounts would have been able to pick up on some of these inconsistencies that perhaps made them less credible,
right?
As you know, in terms of fitting into the Bible and into that criteria. And there were, you started talking through some of the criteria, but there was that criteria that scholars who were funded by the Roman Emperor Constantine, who they had this criteria on books that would make it in and would not make it in. And, you know, it was a lot of these kind of things. You know, did they conform to, you know, rule of faith, you know, general acceptance of faith, the Apostles' Creed that's talked about in 1 Corinthians. You know, did they have apostolic authority, and then also were they accepted by the church at large? Essentially, were some of the criteria, and just some of these books did not meet that criteria.
Right. So yeah, I think for one, I mean, sake of time, do you feel anything else you want to add there? I have lists of what some of those are. Like there's ones where like we think could have been helpful or could have provided interesting context, like the list of the Gospels of Andrew, Bartholomew, Barnabas. There's memoirs of the apostles. We just don't have them. Like we don't have copy. They didn't survive, you know?
Yep.
And there may even be reasons specific to them not surviving. Like, again, the one I liked your analogy of the safe, like you put in the safe what is valuable. So there's a reason that the ones that did survived because people protected them and copied them so meticulously and so on. And then we have ones that we just like, you know, no, don't pass the test. Oh, you know, written hundreds of years later, obvious embellishment, obvious, you know, change with time that falls in that, you know, Gospel of Thomas, Judas, so on. So a lot of those in that category. But
and as you dive into those Gospels, you'll discover that there are some similarities between like the Gospel of Thomas, between that and then some of the New Testament Gospels. But then there's like really weird out there things that don't make any sense at all. And so that's part of the, like, we should almost be grateful for like the 4 that we have, knowing that like there was this meticulous looking at other ones to go like, no, if it's not perfectly in line, it can't measure up to these other 4. You know?
And this is, I mean, we're going with the courtroom analogy of investigating. There's absolutely evidence that you would throw out as, you know, tainted, biased, inaccurate, you know, and that would be an obvious part of the process when this was authentically done. So.
And the big one there is, the ones that were written 100 or 200 years after, you know, the life of Jesus. Those are the ones that really don't make it in. It's the ones that are written literally within a generation of that are the most important ones. And by the people who were literally there or were directly related or close to the people who were actually there too.
Which should floor people, right? Like hundreds of years is great by the general standard of history, but there's such a high standard for the scriptures that it's like, nope, sorry, don't make it in.
And we didn't get to go into this too, but 1 Corinthians is a really cool one because it has the Apostles' Creed, which is, you know, for what has been written to me, I've received from you and I've passed down. And he talks about basically these core tenets of the Christian faith, that Christ died and he was raised on the 3rd day, died for the forgiveness of sins. So you have the Apostles' Creed. There's evidence to support that Paul actually wrote that within like 2 to 8 years after Jesus' death. So you have Paul on the road to Damascus, becomes a Christian, you know, that whole piece of his story, complete 180-degree turn. And then he goes and he meets with the disciples of Jesus, either in Jerusalem, or we think that maybe he went to Damascus and talked to some of the followers of Jesus there. And he gets this creed and he writes it down, which is crazy because you have the core tenets of Christianity, you know, recorded in a historical document that scholars would say, yes, this is when this was written down. And that's just within like 2 years. So it goes even further than the chart that we talked about. But yeah, just talking more about like how amazing these documents are that we have in the New Testament. And I'll just put this quote in there to wrap up this question too. It's from Bruce Metzger, who's a biblical scholar from Princeton Theological Seminary. And he's talking about the canon of the Bible and it being put together. And he says, when the pronouncement was made about the canon, it merely ratified what the general sensitivity of the church had already determined. It's a list of authoritative books rather than an authoritative list of books. So it's not like me posting on a blog, hey, here's a bunch of books that are great, and I put them together in one book. It's like, no, these were already had so much authority even before they were put together. So I just think that's a helpful quote.
Agreed.
Cool. So going on to number 2, I'll let you answer number 2.
Okay.
Where we started off. To follow or not to follow Jesus had me wondering what your thoughts are on people who live in communities where they don't hear about Jesus. Where do people of these communities lie on the spectrum that is to follow or not follow?
Yeah. So when I looked at this, I was, kind of curious about the intent a little bit, because I have heard a similar question in relation to really kind of like a heaven and hell conversation. Like, what about people who don't hear about Jesus? That may be the intent of this question. I also didn't know, does it almost seem to be like more of like a lived experience now? And so, maybe you can try to hit both quickly. One of the ways that I like to engage this question is, even the further I get in my faith and so on, I really try to be careful about not speaking to things that the scriptures don't give a clear answer on. And to me, the scriptures don't give a clear enough answer of how this is handled. There's a very clear, like, okay, the only way into heaven is through Jesus. So I get that. And some could argue, well, there's your clear answer. And I think the other thing that's really difficult about that is, in terms of the reason that why this question is asked, I think a lot of times it's like questioning God, the goodness of God, the justice of God, something like that. And all of that is very clear in the scriptures, that he is good, that he is just. And so I can find peace in that he reconciles that in a way that perhaps, I don't fully understand. I do think what's interesting, especially in like Hebrews 11, is you have this whole chapter devoted to people who are made righteous by their faith pre-Jesus, right? They're all these historical figures, meaning like Jesus died for past, present, and future sin.
Right.
So even though we didn't have like the full revelation of like his name, his story, the cross, and all of that, there was a general revelation of, I can't save myself. I need something outside of me, right? And that faith in God is what ultimately led to like, there's a gospel that's going to be more fully revealed to us in the future. And that would have held true. The minute that Jesus died, somebody died a minute later somewhere else on the planet. It wasn't now like just because Jesus had been here, now everybody had access to all that information. So I do find some peace in like thinking like, man, there's potentially a way that God like handles that's totally outside of my understanding, that is still like faith in him, that he empowers faith in him, even to people that don't have as specific of the revelation as we do when we're able to hold the New Testament in our hands. There's also some stuff like it's harder for us, I think, in our culture and world and so on. But like one of the most common ways that people in more underdeveloped parts of the world and Eastern countries as well, like come to faith is through dreams. Like there are like legitimate, like this isn't like a one-off thing. I mean, it's millions and millions of people. I think there are lots of tools that God, obviously has available to him that get kind of weird. And if you're like new to faith and exploring faith, maybe it feels a little hocus pocus, and I totally get that. I just think for me, there's a little bit of like, we have some direction from the Old Testament, like some direction in terms of God's character, some direction in terms of faith. And then there's a trusting him kind of with the rest that I really don't want to like speak on and say, I know the answer to that,
Yeah, this is one of those questions that, we can look at a lot of evidence for the core tenets of the Christian faith, the resurrection, the death of Jesus, those kind of things. And this is one of those domino questions that we just don't have a black and white answer for. Mm-hmm. And it is just tough. And there becomes this trust component to God. I don't know what you would do with people who live in communities that don't have access to the Bible or the New Testament, but you're God and we're not.
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of an important, not emotionally satisfying truism in that as well.
Yeah.
Just he sees things on an entirely different level than we do, far greater than we can comprehend.
Now, if that's not a heaven or hell question, though, what I do think is like, I actually think it brings up like a good urgency. Like there was a clear urgency as soon as, first Easter happens, right after resurrection.
Yeah.
There's this incredible urgency to spread the gospel, and I think that we should still be in that. Like the job's not done, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't know why I just had a Kobe Bryant job's not finished interview flash in my head. But anyways,
same thing happened
I was thinking you had it first.
Yeah.
But it's like,
I was going to wonder if you were going to say anything about it.
But that is true. And obviously there are incredible organizations that are devoted to this. There are great organizations translating, scripture into different languages, trying to infiltrate governments that are, oppressive regimes that don't allow, anything about Jesus into their world or culture. And so there should be that sense of urgency, I think, to share the gospel, to spread the gospel, to go to the ends of the earth, like Jesus said. Yep. And that kind of dissatisfaction in us, like even if heaven and hell is, somehow satisfied and God, has a plan for that, there's this like, man, still people are like day-to-day life without the presence relationship with Jesus. And that alone should bother us.
Yep.
And cause us to want us to do something about that. So,
Yep. Yeah, that's great. And I would say on the heaven, if it is heaven or hell kind of question, one of the really interesting resources, books, if someone wants to explore that more, the thing you said about like dreams, it's not exactly this, but it's called Imagine Heaven by John Burke. And it's about near-death experiences, not exactly dreams, but there's some data in there about dreams as well. But it just talks about some of these sort of revelations that people have, for lack of a better term, about Jesus, even when they've had like zero connection to him throughout their entire life based on where they live. So I think that's just a good resource, and it's a really interesting read. So and listen, it's a great listen as well on Audible. So okay, let's move on. We might only be able to get to a few questions here. That's probably partially my fault too, for going too long on some of these. But this third question is really important, and depending on this one, we'll either do one more or we'll punt a couple of these to next week as well.
Cool.
But the third question is, why is Jesus dying on the cross the reason our sins are forgiven? How did one man's crucifixion forgive all people for eternity?
Yeah, it's like, it's fun because it's like, this is the question. Right?
Oh, this is the most important one.
Yeah, and so I really love that somebody asked it. I think what's hard again is there's probably like a full length novel answer, and probably we should try to make it simple too, because it shouldn't be overly complicated either. Yeah. So I think, to me, like, when this first hits me as a question of value, right? Like, how much does something have to be worth, basically, in your eyes to like cover, this is saying like all people for eternity. So it seems like a value question. So I think this starts with like Romans 6, the wages of sin are death, like the cost to our sin, to our broken relationship with God. There's a high cost to that, a penalty, right? Yeah. And the reason that God doesn't just snap his fingers and say it's all good is like that would violate him being a God of justice. That would violate his goodness. And so now we're like, okay, you drove your car through your neighbor's fence. They're a kind, sweet old lady that's not even mad at you, perhaps, and don't take that analogy too far, but God does get mad at sin, but it's like, right. You just go through it. Somebody still got to pay to fix the fence. Like there's a cost, there's a time, there's an energy, there's an effort. So we just know that whenever something is broken, there's a cost to repair. Every sin is ultimately a sin against God, right? And so there's a tremendous weight and penalty to every sin. And this isn't about counting them. We're in this permanent state of brokenness. I think we've used in messages before that kind of analogy of like the consequence to our sin, that the consequence is directly related to the authority.
The size of the authority.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. If I lie to a 2-year-old friend, I don't know if you can lie to at 4, whenever you can start speaking, whenever you can say words, it doesn't, your friend forgets about it 30 seconds later. You lie to your parents, they have more authority. They can take your car keys. You lie to a university, you plagiarize on a test, they can kick you out, make it hard for you to get a job. You lie to the Supreme Court, you can go to jail, right? Like it's all one act, but the consequence gets bigger as the authority gets bigger. So if God is real, if he's the creator of the universe, that's the drop of rain in the Pacific Ocean, metaphor. Like the authority of the Supreme Court is like a drop of rain in the ocean compared to the authority of God. And so there is this tremendous chasm that none of us can, conquer, that none of us can pay for. We can't redeem ourselves. And throughout the Old Testament, God keeps trying to give us opportunities to do that. He creates, their covenants, these new agreements. Here's how we can be made right again. He keeps, and we don't uphold our side of the bargain again and again and again. Yep. And so finally, he's like, I'm going to step into your side of the equation. I'm going to send God in human form, right? I'm going to send Jesus for you. And that's why it matters so much that he was both God and man. So as the only sinless human that's ever lived, the only one who's not deserving of these wages, that is not deserving of death because he's lived the perfect life. He's satisfied the side of the agreement in full. And as God, meaning infinite value and worth, right? Like you can't put a price tag on him. So this is now like, how big does God get in our mind? How holy, like how much value does Jesus have in our mind? He's the perfect substitute for those reasons. Fully God, fully human, never sinned, means he can step in as a substitute for us. And, we were talking ahead of time. It's that same series we just did when we went through Romans, whereas like one sin entered the world through Adam. Now this opportunity for forgiveness, grace, like enters the world through Jesus because he cancels out, offsets. Yeah. But that's why, I think that's why my mind goes to a value question, because it's like, how did one man, for all people and for all eternity? Well, that one man, it requires us to think about the value that was, actually paid for us in Jesus, which is infinite. You can't put a price price tag on him.
Yeah, I was also going to add too is like, some people go with the question in that of, well, why does there have to be this gap? Like, why does there have to be a chasm in the first place? Like, why can't God just be God and just cancel it out? Yeah. But God, by definition, must be God, which means he must be perfect. And so it would be imperfect, and it'd be an imperfect system of justice if he were just to go like, you know what, there's a giant chasm, no biggie. It's like we're sitting in a courtroom and someone, does something and we know they're guilty, and the judge just goes, you know what, I'm gonna let you off without a hook, it's all good. We would go like, they're an imperfect judge. Like, they're not doing what they were designed. And God by definition must be perfect. And so the chasm is there because of his perfection and him being God. And I think a really great resource on this too, because one of the wins from this podcast is that people would go do their own exploring and investigating. But Michael, just YouTube Michael Ramstein, Justice of God, and you will find a lot of information on this from a really brilliant man who talks about this kind of chasm and justice of God. But and I just want to read Romans 5 too, because I think it summarizes kind of the end of the answer for this question. But Romans 5, Paul writes, consequently, just as one trespass resulted in condemnation for all people, talking about Adam, so also one righteous act resulted in justification and life for all people. Just as through the disobedience of the one man, the many were made sinners, so also through the obedience of the one man, the many will be made righteous. And that kind of summarizes, in Romans, the answer to this question. So, awesome. Well, do you think we have time for one more?
You can take a shot.
Okay, let's do one more. We'll punt the last one to next week.
Cool.
Excuse me. Simple question to ask, very complicated question to answer. Question 4, does everything happen for a reason?
Man, yeah, like, again, it's one of those like, man, what's the heart or the motive behind it? Like, good question. I think it gets hard if it's like, am I asking this from a place of like regret or guilt or pain? Am I asking this for a reason of hope? Is it or purely just intellectual? Is it, and if I'm sitting one-on-one with somebody, I'm probably going to answer a little different. I don't know if the answer changes in terms of like truth, but like just, I would come at it from
how
different
we approach.
Angles. Right.
Yeah. It's hard to empathize, understand what people are going through just through sitting here with microphones. And so to whoever's asking this question, whatever's going on, we just feel for you as we try to navigate this answer.
Yeah, 100%. And I don't know if they, knowingly or unknowingly, understood what was being brought up, but this is like now an age-old debate of kind of like, are we determined? This is like a free will versus God's sovereignty kind of question, which is tackled by every philosophy, every religion, every worldview. So there's a lot to it. I think when people try to take like the Bible and say like, man, everything happens for a reason, I think there's a couple verses that come to my mind. And typically I think these verses are actually taken a little out of context. Romans 8:28 says, we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him and who have been called according to his purpose. That doesn't mean that all things are good or that all things were supposed to have happened, if you will. It just means that God is in total control and is able to bring good out of even the worst of situations. Jeremiah 29:11 has more of an abuse, and I feel bad if somebody has painted on their home or a T-shirt or whatever. But
you're just squashing on house decor in this one.
Yeah, it's a pretty common college verse, we put on cards or whatever. Verse 11 says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you, not to harm you, plans to give you hope in a future." And so we take that, and everybody's got this like perfect, kind of happy plan individualized to them. But in context, just like the verse right before that says, "This is what the Lord says: when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and will fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have to you." So he's saying, hey, in 70 years to a very specific people group, I know the plans that I have for you. And there is a principle, of course, that there is a general will like for our life that God has for us that is in that. It's not a complete abuse, but it's not what he's trying to say in the context of Jeremiah 29. So I think like then we have to like pull back and now we're looking at some of these bigger conversations, which the fastest I could come to, and I'd have to acknowledge like some of this is even just like personal to me. So like, we could probably have people on our staff that would have different combos around this. But for me, it seems that the scriptures affirm both, yes, like God is totally, absolutely in control at all times, sustaining all things all the time.
Yep.
And there seems like a very clear impetus that our decisions have meaning. like that they matter. The whole New Testament of applications of Jesus' ethic of how to love one another wouldn't need to exist if we didn't need some kind of instruction and have the ability to decide, do we want to trust God or not trust God with our lives? There's a very central like love piece to this, that if we were just robots that didn't have the opportunity to choose God, that's not the truest definition of love. And so I think that gets complicated for people when you're like, it's both, you know, that God is totally in control. So yes, there is a grand purpose. The reason we can trust what's going to happen in the future and trust that Jesus will come back one day is of course, because like God knows and is in control of all of this. But we have like, you know, I like the phrase meaningful choice over free will. I think most people could get to like free will being an illusion pretty fast, just to be like, you didn't choose the year you were born, the time of place you were born. You and I definitely didn't choose our height. Like we know that we don't have like control over a whole lot of factors in the world. So we all have limited ability to control our lives as it is. And so the way that I tend to reconcile that, and it gets complicated and there's words for it, but I just tend to believe that God is able in his like overall infinite wisdom to be able to place people in positions where the choices they would choose to make would also bring about his ultimate plan. I give like kind of the simple analogy of like, you know, you're a runner, you're training for a marathon. If I offered you some warm spoiled milk at the end of your race or a Gatorade, I know that you're going to choose the Gatorade, right?
Yep.
And so like, that doesn't mean I forced you to choose the Gatorade. And so it's not just God's pre-knowledge, that's a different thing too. But I think he is able to like put all the puzzle pieces together in such a way that people are going to make choices of their own volition, trust or not trust him of their own volition. And those decisions bring about his ultimate plan and good. So does that mean everything happens for a reason? Well, it kind of depends on how you just interpreted what I said. Like, God is ultimately bringing about good, yes. Do some things happen and just kind of cause chaos out of our sinfulness and depravity? Yes. Like we just make messes of things that isn't really what God wanted. Can God bring good out of even the worst of scenarios? Also, yes. Like he can redeem anything. So depending on why you asked that question, hopefully the answer was in there, but I don't know.
I also think, you know, it's important to note that God is talking to Babylon, to the people of Babylon. He's not talking to us when he says, you know, and this is not emotionally satisfying at all. He's not talking to us when he says, "For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper and not to harm you, give you hope in the future." That is not like fun to hear that he's not talking to us in that. But he does say in Romans 8:28, he talked about, we know all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. And what's tough is that does not mean that God is going to give you all the outcomes you want in life that are going to lead to ultimate happiness. But it means that God might give you outcomes that are difficult, that are going to lead to ultimate fulfillment and joy, not in your circumstances, but because of his spirit in your life and his presence in your life and your relationship with him. And so I think that's just, and I love, one of my favorite verses in all the Bible is at the end of Genesis, when Joseph is looking at his brothers after they've betrayed him his whole life. And he just says, for what you intended to harm me, God meant for good. And I love that verse because it just says that exact thing. It's like, no matter what happens to me, God did this for good. And it wasn't good externally, it was good internally. And I think as we look at the one who's asking the question, does everything happen for a reason? That does not feel good to come to that conclusion, but I do think there is good that can happen. And I remember, you know, one small example that scratches the surface of this. We had a buddy who passed away when we were in high school, and we were in this mode of asking the similar question of like, can anything good come from this? He was 16, like what the heck? It was our small group leader's son, actually, so it was very personal to us. I was on the wrestling team with him, and then our buddy had this girlfriend, and she was kind of out on church, but this whole experience kind of brought her in to actually accept Christ and changed her life, and then changed her family's life as well. And it was a small sliver of like, well then what about his death, and how, you know, and you can't compare, there's this much good for this bad, like I don't know, but it was a small sliver for me. And I've heard so many other stories and seen so many other stories where God takes something horrible and he works something really good in it and through it. So yeah, that's a tough question though. And whoever's asking it, I hope whatever circumstances cause you to ask it, that God is just meeting you in those circumstances. So Awesome. Well, we are out of time now, so let's wrap up. We have another question on here, but we'll get to it first next week. So if this is your question, talking about God-breathed scripture, that whole thing, we are going to talk about that first thing next time. Part 2, we're continuing the discussion more in depth on the question of who is Jesus, and we're really going to dive into not just the question, but it's kind of a more of a multiple choice question than we think. And the reason is because of some things Jesus says, and so we're going to talk about that this Sunday, and I'm really excited for your message for part 2, and we'll continue over time the week after as well. So thanks so much for listening. We hope you guys have a great spring break, and we'll see you either Sunday online or in person.
Welcome horns.